welcome to the 1000 Amp podcast, where we talk about game development and many related topics around it. Today, I'm joined by Professor Mike Sellers, who is the Director of Game Design at Indiana University and also the author of the wonderful book, Advanced Game Design, which I've actually been talking about a lot on the channel if you've been paying attention. Thank you so much for taking the time today.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So I think one of the kind of places to jump in would just be, I would love to hear a little bit about little story time, just about how you got into the game business. As much or as little detail as you want to share, you know.
Sure.
But I know that people always love to hear kind of a little bit of background before we start to share our ideas and opinions.
Yeah, so let me go back to when dinosaurs ruled the earth, that is, say, the 1980s. And I'll go through this quickly, but it's a weird path, and I want to preface this by saying that for anybody listening, this is a path that I don't think you could do today. It's like I came up through the Pirates or Buccaneers, I don't know, something weird like that. Anyway, so I got my degree, my undergraduate degree in cognitive science, which at the time was brand new. I had to convince my college to let me do it. Like nobody knew about it at all. Graduated, became a software engineer, and my goal actually was to become a neurosurgeon at first. And I actually had one Friday afternoon where I had gotten a job offer. I was actually a junior, and I got a job offer to be like a for real programmer. And a professor told me that he would give me a spot in this as a neuroscience fellow in a neuroscience center. So I had this like medical school or software engineering, and I chose software. It was like this one Friday afternoon I had to make this decision. So it was like this big divide in my life. Sorry, that's way too much detail.
No. Well, I mean, that's kind of amazing, right? Because it's rare that you have those kind of clear turning points, right?
Yeah, it was. Yeah, and I could see it to these roads going like this. Later, I did have the opportunity to work for a company doing medical imaging, and I actually got to stand in on some neurosurgeries in the operating room. And it was great. I knew all the lingo. I knew what was going on, but I also didn't have to stay there for the full time.
Right.
Anyway, so actually, I was a software engineer, and then I was a user interface designer, and that's where I got into the medical imaging company. And this company kept trying to say, why can't we make our interfaces more game-like? And so I would throw up some things that were game-like, and they say, well, that's not serious enough. I'm like, okay, so you want it game-like but serious. And actually, one evening, another one of these sort of singular times, it was like 9:00 at night, and I was driving home because I'd been in a neurosurgery all day long, where the software that I had done the user interface for had just saved the life of a 5-year-old girl. Wow. It was the first time I'd used it. It was amazing. It was incredible. And yet I could not get excited about it. I just kept thinking about, well, yeah, I got this to do and this to do. And it was like, I should be on top of the world right now. Like maybe this is, a sign. I've had a few of these experiences where this is a moment you got to really think about this, So I said, okay, maybe it's time to make a change. So I did. I did some user interface consulting. I left the company on very good terms. I consulted for them for about a year. And then my brother and I have been kind of looking for what to do to start a company. This is the early 90s. And so we said, well, maybe let's talk about starting a game company. And this was in the days when like CD-ROMs were really big and there's a lot of CD-ROM shovelware. We actually looked at doing screensavers at first. We're like, we want to do a screensavers with a little bit of game-like stuff in them. I've been playing games, and I designed a role-playing game in the 80s and stuff like that, all on paper.
Yeah.
Anyway, so in 93, 94, I'd have to go back and look, actually, we formed a company. And I had this idea. I've been playing a lot of text muds, and I knew the 3D stuff was coming up. And so this idea to make a game where you could be in a world with a bunch of other people together, MMOs today. So we had the first 3D MMO.
Wow.
It was a game called Meridian 59. It was actually published in 1996 by 3DO. They acquired our company. Again, there's a lot of twists and turns here, but they found out about us in like February and acquired us by the end of June. They had to make that end of the quarter.
Wow.
And then the game came out in September. So that was kind of my, then we were off to the races. So my brother and I and another guy went and did another startup called The Big Network, and which was sort of family-oriented chat rooms and games. So the high concept pitch was my kids and their cousins could go online and play games together without having to be in an AOL chat room. For anybody who remembers AOL chat rooms.
I remember, yeah. That was just right. The beginning of my internet experience was that time, yeah.
So we had a lot. We had really one of the early social networking sites. We sold that company as well, and then I went off to Electronic Arts, went off to Maxis, and was hired there to do SimCity Online.
Wow!
And it was like a SimCity MMO, and we had some really good things going on there. And then this little game finally came out called The Sims, and I did a little bit of work on the initial Sims, but that thing was just a monster hit, as everyone knows now. So everything inside the studio became about The Sims.
Right.
And so my game eventually became The Sims 2, which came out, and I've got a lot of good work in there on aspirations and things like that. We were trying to make the Sims have longer term goals. But I was honestly a little bit frustrated with how things were going. So I went down to Austin, Texas to join Origin, another EA studio, to work on Ultima Online. And after about a year there, decided to go ahead and take another leap and start my own company again. So I started a company called Online Alchemy with the idea to make non-player characters in a game that were more than just vending machines, that you could interact with socially. So we did some work with DARPA, actually some really interesting, phenomenal work with Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency.
Wow.
The high concept was to teach soldiers how not to shoot people. So the idea was to have train soldiers in how to deal with civilians in ways that would de-escalate rather than escalate problems. And for that, we need a lot of AI. There's a lot of wonderful things about The Sims, but the AI, especially in early Sims, was not one of them. So I wanted to redo that, or do it my own way. So I ran that company for about 9 years, actually. And then a lot of ups and downs. We were doing an MMO for a Chinese publisher. They wanted to come into the U.S. market. That I still think is an interesting, offbeat but good idea. It was you were building a restaurant empire. So it's like Diner Dash. You were building restaurants and building an empire out of it, and you could do as much detail or as little as you wanted. And they had some requirements. Like it had to be about restaurants, had to be a restaurant empire, and it had to have PvP. We're like, okay, how do you do PvP with a restaurant empire? We actually came up with a pretty cool way to do it, I think, where you could escalate. Like I could say, okay, so you and I have competing restaurants. I'm going to spread a rumor about your restaurant. And that might tick your sales down a little, but that's not a terrible thing, right? And you could like publish a bad story in the paper. It's like the next worst thing. But if you've done that, you're now open by me doing the rumor. I open myself up to the bad story, and you've opened yourself up to having ants placed in your restaurant. Which if I did that, you have this escalating thing all the way up to like firebombing somebody's restaurant. But you could never have that happen if you hadn't asked for it, basically.
Right.
So
that's interesting.
Anyway. Yeah. And unfortunately, we got to beta, and then they said, maybe not so much for the U.S. market, and so shut it down. And so I actually had to shut my company down. It was a long struggle, one of the hardest things I've ever done, really. Went to work for a company called Kabam in the Bay Area. They're big in Facebook games and mobile games. And then briefly at a company called Rumble, and then came to Indiana University. So during that whole time, though, I had taken some of the... I know I always wanted to go into academia at some point. And so I'd taken some of the AI work that we had done with DARPA and published it, did some peer review research and published it, taught a couple classes online. And so I was able to position myself to say, okay, when the time is right, I'm now ready to go into academia. Not having a PhD because, when I was coming up, we didn't have those in games.
Yeah.
But I've always had a research bent, and as sort of product and research both. I like them both. Anyway, so that was 7 years ago in July. I came to Indiana University and helped them. I came on the first few months as a consultant to sort of help form the program. And it took us about another year to actually get it all nailed down and approved. So we're just ending the 6th year, or I've just ended the 6th year of our game design program, where we wanted to make it as industry relevant as possible. So because Indiana University is a state university, the students here get all the benefits of a good liberal arts education. There's a lot to be said for that.
Yeah.
But in terms of game design, there's a lot of technical knowledge and teamwork knowledge, soft skills they call them, that you have to have as well. So we actually set out from the beginning, we said, let's make this program. But I said, if we're going to do this, we're really going to do this. I didn't want to make a kind of crappy program.
Yeah.
So we said, let's make this pre-med hard. And so we have.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, the students really enjoy the program. We get a lot of good reviews, and they actually just made a video. Some of the students made a video about the program it warms my heart to see it. They talk a lot about the collaborative nature and how they learn to work in teams and all those things. So one of the things we did was we said we want our students to come out of the program with a published game. Yeah. So by the time they're done, they've worked for almost 2 years on one team or multiple teams, depending, because we cancel games along the way. So they've had all that experience of going from an original concept to, hey, this is fun, to, oh no, this is work, to, why are we still doing this? To, I just want to get it out the door. But as one CEO who's hired several of our graduates has said, they come out with 1 to 3 years worth of experience. So that's really what we're aiming for. And I didn't want to have just sort of, people like, great, you're a graduate, but now we need to teach you all the stuff you should have learned.
Yeah.
So,
which is, I would say, is a kind of a thing, right? It's a known dynamic. Yeah.
It is definitely, and it's better than it used to be. A lot of the programs that are out there now are better, but it's still a big issue.
Yeah.
If I could, I would bring them out with 5 years experience, but you can only cram so much into somebody's head. So
yeah.
But that's been it's been terrific for me because I love teaching, I love mentoring, and lets me do some of the crazier things that industry didn't quite support with some of my own projects. So
awesome. I mean, that's amazing, and I think that I love that approach in terms of the design of the program. Of, as we know, there's no substitute for. I mean, obviously, there's an important place for theory and kind of conceptual knowledge, but there's no substitute for doing and hands-on experience. Obviously, in a rigorous way. And I think that having people coming out, having worked on larger scale projects, I think some people who go through programs and do like multiple small projects have a little bit of not a false idea, but don't really know what it's like to do something bigger, right? And all of there's a difference in category, or a difference in kind as you scale up, right? That you don't necessarily learn working on small things.
Think about being a professional. You're going to be on a team with someone for a year, 5 years, something like that. Yeah. And at some point, you're not going to like the other people on your team.
Yeah.
How do you deal with it? You may think they're great people at some level, but once you've been working with somebody for a year, 18 months, 2 years, there's at some point where you go, I don't want to be doing this anymore. And that's where you have to be professional and say, okay, we've got to see this through.
Yeah.
And having a series of 8-week projects gets you more sprints, literally both agile and in terms of like running sprint, but not a marathon. Yeah. And game dev is always a marathon. The other thing is I have been working on sort of trying to write down, articulate my own thoughts about game design for years. And industry really doesn't support that necessarily because there's so much going on.
Yeah.
And so being in academia has given me the time to say, okay, what were all the things I was thinking about? How can I help articulate and codify some of those things? And I think that's helped me be a better teacher, be a better educator. And the timing is really interesting too, because we're at a time in game design where we're just beginning to have some real game design theory. It feels to me like the beginning of chemistry or physics or something. So there's a bunch of us. I mean, Daniel Cook, I should say, Raf Koster, Stefan Bura, Joris Dormans, myself, a bunch of other people, all kind of looking at these same issues and saying, how can we articulate what it is we're really doing? And so that's what my book was all about, was trying to get all those thoughts into printed form where I wasn't just teaching it verbally anymore.
That's a great segue to talk about the book. So I've been talking about the book a bit through some of my other videos that I've done on the channel and evangelizing it. I feel like it's a phenomenal resource. And I think that, as you say, I mean, I'm somebody who loves reading and loves, learning from books. And I have read, I'm not going to say all, but many of the commercially available game design books, right? And there's some that I love and recommend. But that point that you make about us being in a kind of a moment of a kind of a rigorous framework of theory emerging is definitely something that I observe. That in terms of shared vocabulary, in terms of just kind of shared conceptual frameworks, it's all over the place. Somehow you would wrongly in my case, expect that some of that games are obviously kind of ancient, and video games now as an industry has been around for a while, right? So you would think like, okay, maybe we could gather together around some kind of agreed best practices and ideas, but obviously we're still early stages on that.
Yeah, we really are. And I love that because I love being at sort of at the forefront of things.
Totally.
But it's hard, and it makes it hard to figure out, okay, what is our shared vocabulary? You know, there's been a lot of conversations, well, over time about what does it mean to be a producer versus a lead designer versus a senior designer. You know, what do these titles mean? We don't even know that, much less what's the definition of interactivity. This is something I did kind of a deep dive on. And there's a lot of literature on it, but none of it agrees. Not even just in games, but in like the communications literature. And so I finally came up with some practical, workable definitions from the game's point of view for what does interactivity mean in a game? How do we think about that? That fortunately holds up to scrutiny and to meshes well with other people's work as well.
Yeah.
But I mean, I loved it. So I, on the one hand, I love the fact that we're trying to figure all that out. It also makes it really hard. I was part of a workshop a few years ago, 2-3 years ago, where we were talking about constructing emergence. This is part of Project Horseshoe. And we actually ended up writing a paper about it. And I really want to go back at some point and rewrite that paper because it was like a good, not even maybe a rough draft, but it was a good first attempt,
Yeah.
you know. But it's so hard. Like we all know emergence in games is really important and amazing when you see it. How do you get there? And how can you get there within a framework that you can articulate? That's something we don't really know yet.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of these things that are just, I mean, it's a great time to be in the industry, but I think also maybe a little frustrating because we don't have that basis yet to make things easier.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, well, there's a couple of threads I want to grab and pull on there, but the emergence theme is a huge one. And for me is probably at the heart of what is interesting about games, or maybe the more, and, you know, systems thinking is one of the kind of themes that you talk about in your book, and this kind of systemic, dynamic, emergent nature of games is, I think, one of the things that, as a medium, that we have uniquely, and it's a place to experience this and understand it and feel it and play with it that, you know, maybe you get in like markets or politics or something, but obviously there's whole different sets of consequences associated with those, right? So,
yeah,
it's a rich topic.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that's attracted me to games, even before I could really articulate a lot of these thoughts. But the idea that when I read a book, I can go back and read the book the second time, and the book is exactly the same. I might be different, and the result might be different because I'm a different person. But with a game, every time I play it, it's different for me because the game reacts to what I do and I react to it. So I talk in the book a lot about loops.
Yeah.
I think I don't know if they've actually created a bingo card yet, but my students talk about, when I say systems or loops, they like, yeah, that's, you know, they hear it a lot from me.
Yeah.
But yeah, this idea that I have an intention with something in the game I want to do, I do that thing. The game does something internally, so it's non-trivial, and gives me feedback for it, which gives me new intent.
Yeah.
That sets up this interactive loop. And to me, one of the amazing things that I was sort of realized, I guess, in writing about all this, was that creates a system. So there's a system inside the game, there's a system or systems inside my head, and there's a system between me and the game that's going to be unique. It's going to be different from your experience, and different from my experience another time, playing the same game. And we see degrees there too, where if we both play the same shooter that's on rails, we're going to have a pretty similar experience. But if we both play SimCity or Slime Rancher, we're going to have very different experiences. And I think we're just beginning to tap into that because we're just beginning to understand, oh, here's how we create those kinds of systems that provide a broad experiential palette rather than a narrow, you're going to go down this track in the game.
Yeah, I totally agree. I love that you mentioned Slime Rancher, actually. I just was replaying Slime Rancher recently for research on the game that I'm working on. The kind of capacity of games for emergence and that kind of on rails versus more, call it sandbox-like or open systemic games. I feel like one of the things that we've seen with the current moment that we're in terms of the games market, there's a couple of there's the kind of the rise of the indie movement and indie as a kind of a mode of making games. And then you have the kind of mega budget Red Dead Redemption type huge financial investments, right? When you get into the commercial side of games, you understand the desire to put everything on narrow rails, guardrails. You get shot by this guy at this time. We're delivering a consistent product for the player, and there's not going to be some weird moment where something totally unexpected happens, right? Like, you get that from a commercial perspective because you're like, it's a McDonald's hamburger. It's the same every time, right? And that is, as a commercial product, that's viable and understandable, right? But I think that it's this other category that I think is more artistically interesting and more systemically interesting, but also obviously is accompanied by risk, right? And
let's talk about that for a second.
Yeah,
it is, but it's actually, I think there's a lot less risk there than we believe. So first of all, there are some. I would say AA, AAA. I'm not sure the gradation there, but thinking about games like Stellaris, one of my favorites, or Crusader Kings. I only let myself play Stellaris during the summertime, by the way, because I'm behind on my grading enough during the year. So, but those are highly systemic games where, the famous story of Crusader Kings 2, I think, where the guy got a horse to be Pope. You can find that online. It's a pretty interesting story, but it happens through the systems and the interactions in the game. So the parallel that I have for that, though, is back before free-to-play was a big deal, there was a lot of discussion in the online space, like an MMO space, about moving away from the subscription model. And a lot of the big US-based developers and publishers didn't want to move away from that model because they knew we're going to get $10 to $15 every month.
Yeah.
And it's this known quantity. We can predict it. We can spreadsheet it. It's a good thing for business. And, who knows, you free to play, maybe you won't make any money, maybe you'll make a lot of money, but it's a lot more risk. That was the perception.
Yeah.
And a few, we had some Asian games, and I think Puzzle Pirates was one of the very first, if not the first in the US market that did free to play. And what they were able to show was, yes, you get a lot more differences across people, but the aggregate is actually really predictable. And you can say, and now we have terms like ARPU and ARPPU and all of those. We can say, I know what I'm going to get on an average from all my users. If I have this many users, I'm going to get this much money. So even risk-averse publishers have embraced that. There's a lot of sort of production science in that now, analytical science. And I think there's a similar thing that is coming slowly, first from indies, in terms of systemic design, where eventually the big companies are going to go, the problem with systems is they always look terrible for the first 50, 60, 80% of their life, and then suddenly look amazing. And that's a real problem. And that's I think, as much our own inexperience in making these things. As we get better, that'll be shortened down. But what you don't have is the content furnace, where you're just continually shoveling more and more content. So the reason a AAA game costs so much is because you got to make, so much content with an army of artists and designers and everything else.
Yeah.
If you can cut that down, again, to go back to something like Slime Rancher or Stellaris or Crusader Kings, say, I can do an awful lot more with a much smaller budget. The other thing that I think is really significant, I think is going to catch on, people are going to start to understand this, actually came out in one of Jason Rohrer's talks in 2019. I've talked to this before online, but Life After the Indie Apocalypse, I think. Anyway, where he talks about if you have a game that is only a few hours long, so if it's on rails or it's you have a set experience and it's 4 or 5 hours long, I'm only going to be playing that game for that long, and I might be talking about it for a few days afterwards, but then I'm not. Whereas if I'm playing, here we are talking about Slime Rancher, which came out how many years ago now?
Yes.
So you keep playing these games, which means there's much better word of mouth, better discovery, and longer playtime. And so you get a much longer, more sustainable revenue stream. So even from a business point of view, I think that as we figure out more about how to do systemic design well, it's going to make more and more sense.
I think that's totally well-supported opinion. And actually, the Jason Rohrer talk, I think, is really interesting and important, where he kind of puts out the thesis saying, don't make consumable games, make situation generators, right? Where he's saying, that, and I think from a budget perspective and for us as indies trying to kind of punch above our weight, it's design over the kind of content fire hose, right? It makes a lot of sense. I think actually the point that you make about, it's funny that we're talking so much about Slime Rancher. Nick Popovich from Monomi Park gave a great talk as well, where he talks about this retention model in the premium game, which I really did not, I understand in these kind of freemium games and even on PC games like Dota or League, the idea of retaining people over long periods and the value of that because they have microtransactions. Slime Rancher is not monetized through microtransactions. They did do a couple pieces of DLC and which were smaller things, but he makes a very convincing case that you're, through the mechanics of Steam, you're seeing it popping up, that your friends are playing it, people are talking about it, maybe it's being streamed. It's just kind of present. And I think that kind of connects back to what Rohrer was saying about, he's kind of said, do you play chess, or are you a League or Dota player, or versus have you played? I think he was using Edith Finch as an example. Yeah. But, other kind of narrative type games or consumable type games. To me, I'm convinced of this thesis. I think it's, I'm also just, my orientation is not towards narrative in the game side. So I'm like, yeah, duh. But,
Well, let's talk about narrative here in a second. I want to make one other point on this, and that is that the uncomfortable truth that indies typically don't want to recognize is that there are two sides to game development. One is all the design, programming, all that stuff, and their side is marketing. Yeah. And these should be equal in terms of the amount of effort you put in, and nobody wants to talk about that or believe that that's true. And you can't put, as an indie, you can't put money into marketing. The only thing, and you can say, well, here's my game, I worked really hard on it, please play it, which is kind of what everyone tries to do. Now, some who are very smart, like you, do things like, oh, I'm going to do a bunch of devlogs. I'm going to put my pain out there for why is this not working? But what you're doing along the way is getting people who are saying, oh, that looks pretty interesting. I want to keep up with that. Oh, I want to be on this Discord. Yeah. So that there was a post about this recently about, by doing all those things on day one on Steam, you've got several hundred to 1,000 wish lists, which pops you up, which means you're going to get more people. Now, once you're on top, if you're not a content game, if you are a continue playing systemic game, you're going to stay there for longer. So it's the way, I believe, the best way we have, the only way really that I know of, for indies to break out of the discoverability trap. Yeah. All that said, the downside is, like I said before, and we can talk more about this, I know you've experienced it, you're trying to make these systems work, and they just don't. It's like, okay, I'm going to make 1,000 cakes, and 700 of them are going to be terrible. Yeah. And eventually I'll get one right.
Oh, it's brutal. Yeah, I think that's I love this as a segue. First of all, I totally, the point about, I think there's a couple things about indie games and marketing. This is a topic near and dear to my heart. The part of it is the moment in time. We're in a moment where it's way more clear that just making a good game and getting platform support from a platform holder is not enough, right? That we're in a moment, I'm not going to say we're in a moment of saturation, but we're in a moment where attention is important, and having mechanisms for gathering attention is important, right? Getting your own traffic, getting your own attention. This is something my audience is probably tired of hearing it because I'm beating this drum, but I really believe it. And I think that actually, to even zoom out of the game space, I think that this is actually the new mode just of literally doing business. We're in a systemic mode of disintermediation. Direct to consumer is the model, and therefore counting on magazines look at basically the death of the website as a force in games press, right? It's over. It's not relevant in terms of sales anymore. Culturally, sure. Is it important to have games criticism? Absolutely, right? But as a driver of sales, it's over, right? And I think this is the moment that we're in. Social, YouTube, Twitch, digital word of mouth is all that matters anymore. And
TikTok, I think, is a big
TikTok,
one coming up.
Exactly, huge. It's funny. That's another one. I'm like hammering that. Oh, TikTok is a whole interesting. We could talk about TikTok, but exactly that. I think that we all have to internalize that if you want to be a small business, you have to internalize that you're actually a media company. And sorry if you don't like that, but that's the reality. That's the mode of business for the next 3 years until the world changes again.
Yeah. Well, there's a great saying I love that I read back in the 90s. I can't find the source for it, but it's in a time of abundance, the scarcest resource is attention.
Yeah.
So we are in a time of abundance. And if you think about it, there have been, more or less, call it 200 games that have come out on Steam in the last week, and 200 games week before that, 200 games week before that. How many of those have you played? Yeah. This is something every indie developer should ask themselves. We're all trying to balance, some of our day jobs, our development with playing games. And yet there are all these games that have come out that are people put their hearts and souls into, and that disappear beneath the waves.
Yeah.
And the only way to avoid that is the kind of things we've been talking about.
Yeah.
But it's hard. And this is something, I try and drum into my students, and they'd rather do Jira, honestly. I mean, no one likes Jira. At least, sorry, Jira people. I know there's Jira fans out there. Yeah, sorry, guys. But no, really, I was going to say root canal, but I don't know.
Yeah,
anyway, the marketing is just not something that comes naturally to most, or comfortably to most developers, most indie developers.
Yeah.
The other thing I was going to say, just this sort of maybe gets us a little back to the narrative touch point I dropped a minute ago.
Yeah.
The thing about, if you see a narrative game played like on a Twitch stream, I think this, I want to say maybe Roar's talk again.
Yeah.
The sales go down because effectively you've had that experience.
It's spoiled.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Which is not the case for systemic games.
Totally.
But narrative and systems, there is a bit of a tension there. One of the things I'm trying to do in my work is to explore some of the ways we can combine those. And I'm not alone in this, and I'm not even by no means am I one of the foremost in this. There's a variety, Tanya Short and a bunch of other people. I'm trying to think of all their names at this point, but people are really exploring systemic design with narrative design, and how do you make those two things work together. And I think what we're really all trying to aim for is, how do I create a meaningful experience? Something the player goes, oh, that was not just, maybe it's a fun shooter romp, whatever, that's fine. But
sure.
Or I want something that really means something more to me, and that's where the narrative comes in. If we can make those narratives more systemic, which I believe we can, then I think we're really going to hit on something that is even more valuable than what we have now. But it's hard, and that's an unknown right now. I mean, really, just no one knows how to do it as well as anyone would like.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with that, and I think it's I think Tanya Short has. I don't know if it's come out, but her and is it with Tarn Adams, a procedural narrative book that I know they were working on it.
Two books. They have two books. They have a procedural game design, a procedural narrative. I highly recommend them both.
Yeah,
there's a lot of things in both books that to me are gems, like, highlight this thing, but every one of those is also like, okay, now I want to go spend a month just thinking about this one point and digging into it, because I feel like and no discredit, they're amazing books, but I feel like we're still in the sort of shallow areas, and we need to dig down a lot deeper to figure out, how do we do these things? And my belief, and there are other smart people who disagree with me, but my belief is that one of the things we really need to do is to get rid of the idea of a singular narrative and the authorial imperative at all.
Totally.
Now, the flip side there goes back to, oh gosh, I'm going to say this is Liz England's, I'm pretty sure it is, the 10,000 bowls of oatmeal problem, where you can procedurally generate infinite numbers of bowls of oatmeal, but at the end of the day, they're all bowls of oatmeal.
Totally.
So how do you differentiate these things? And there's people like Max Kremensky and others are doing interesting things with what they call story sifting. Yeah. So out of all these 10,000 bowls of oatmeal, how do you find the one masterpiece? So there's some interesting things going on there, but it's brand new research that a lot of people are doing.
Totally. Yeah. I think that for me, in terms of, I mean, you mentioned Crusader Kings. I would argue that games like Crusader Kings, Dwarf Fortress, EVE Online, these are the games narratives that I'm interested in, which are systems which generate memorable sequences of events that the player can tell a story about, right? Even my first experience of playing Minecraft with my kids, we fell into this hole and discovered a cave. It was like a memorable little story that I told people about, right? Oh yeah. It was like I had an experience, and I remember that experience. And to me, it's not Tolstoy, right? But it's a linear story that came out of a game that I felt worth repeating. And the fact that I would argue probably Dwarf Fortress, right, is people like me, I cannot play Dwarf Fortress. I kind of idolize Tarn Adams is like one of my heroes, right? But I've tried. Yeah. I cannot, like I really have tried.
Yeah.
I've watched like the hours of tutorials and I'm just like, wait, is my X moving or is it not moving? I mean, it's a towering masterpiece in my mind in its singular way. But the fact that that's a piece of software that generates stories that people like me actually want to read, that points a way forward, right? And so it's not a coincidence that he's working with Tanya on those books and kind of, I think, in the forefront there. But I think that's the thread I'm interested in exploring. I know that this will make some people upset, but like I love to read novels. When I was a teenager, I wanted to be a film director and studied a lot of film theory. I just feel like linear, non-interactive media is a great way great, reliable, nuanced, detailed way to deliver narrative. And I'm kind of like, I don't want to replicate that. I think we have a great body of work there. I want to go somewhere different,
Yeah, I think there are things we can learn there, but I think you're exactly right about sort of stories told on the fireside, which is where all stories started, and we get to Tolstoy eventually.
Yeah.
But I think it's an interesting thing here. I have a parallel memory. The first time in Minecraft digging down and seeing suddenly this cave open up beneath me. I think probably everybody who's played Minecraft has that experience. Yeah. And it's this exploratory, like, what's out there?
Yeah.
Or the first time playing D&D and encountering as a teenager and encountering a rust monster. Oh no, what's that? We all have these stories that are not particularly interesting to other people necessarily. It's like, great, you found a cave in Minecraft.
Right.
But if you have a similar experience, then you have the shared meaning. And that's what's really interesting, as opposed to we've all read the same novel.
Right.
And I think we need to, it's going to be a difficult thing, scary, risky thing, but we need to break games out of that model of trying to be a movie or a novel with an author's intended experience for you. Yeah. I think we still get theme, we can still get thematic experiences, but my experience is going to be different than yours.
Yeah.
And I think that is actually part of the strength of this, because then we can talk about it. When I read War and Peace, this happened. Oh, really? When I read it, this happened. If we could have that, we'd have a whole new set of experiences. Really, it's another high level system, but we don't have that yet. I think we're getting there.
Absolutely.
And it's going to take us, some decades. I don't know how long to get there, but
yeah, maybe. I mean, I think actually parallel to that, Jason Greenblatt, who's a narrative person on Caves of Cud, wrote an article about this concept of story volumes, right?
Yeah,
that there's a kind of a volume, and that you might take this path through it, and you might take this path through it, but we're kind of in a shared volume, having related experiences, but it's not literally a linear, scripted. But there is this authorial intent in creating the volume, right? Creating the fish tank that the player is swimming through.
In creating the volume, but not creating the path through the volume.
Exactly.
The difficulty there is, how do you avoid the patches of oatmeal in this volume?
Yeah.
And so that's something, or where the game just breaks. Those are the kinds of things that we need to figure out as game designers. But I think that is sort of the next big leap that we're all, knowing it or not, I think we're all aiming for.
I think also there's an aesthetics question, right? One of the things that I read Derek Yu's book about making Spelunky, one of my kind of beloved games, and it's an amazing book. And he talks about the feeling and the idea of the world feeling indifferent to the player. It's not a Disney theme park where it's signposting and gently holding your hand, taking you through it. That there are moments where, you might kind of run into that patch of oatmeal or a kind of a thicket of thorns or something that isn't beautifully crafted and signposted for you, but that is part of the aesthetic of the world and the experience and which I think is connects to the Minecraft experience, right? That like, you might run into kind of dead ends and dead zones, and there's if you can kind of embrace that aesthetically and saying, well, in real life, sometimes I run into a dead end as well, and
Yeah.
And I think maybe generationally, like, I mean, my kids are like growing up on Minecraft. I mean, it's crazy to me actually now. This is actually a little jump point, but I don't know if you pay attention to the Dream SMP thing. Do you know about this?
No, I don't.
So there's this, talk to a 10-year-old, right? There's a big Minecrafter, million subs, whatever, tens of millions, I don't know, huge online personality named Dream. and they have this thing called SMP, which is a survival multiplayer world, which is basically like they're agreeing to play Minecraft together in this way with a bunch of other famous YouTubers together, basically role playing. And then there are people, if you look up Dream SMP animations, there are people making these animations that tell the story of the dramas and betrayals, and they have countries and national people blow up people's cities and big high dramas, and all the audio in the animation is from the Twitch streams and the YouTube videos, but it's this hand-drawn 2D animation that's great, and it's amazing, and it's all my kid cares about. You know, those are that's his celebrity.
That is
Dream,
terrific.
Tommy in it. That's who he's interested in. And then, of course, he's playing Minecraft, and he's making his own SMP worlds, and, you know, and I'm like, this is amazing. You know, he like shows it to me, and he's like, what do you think, Dad? And I'm like, this is amazing.
There's several really amazing things going on there. First, you've got a bunch of emergent consequences, the SMP world, all things that go in it. But then the spin-off of every one of these animations is this own little emergent thing that couldn't have happened if the primary thing hadn't happened. And it also goes back to our desire to have a narrative.
Yeah.
And to pluck a narrative out of the world when we see it and go, oh, this is special. I want to memorialize this one. And I'm not, you know, I don't think books or movies or any things are going to go away or are bad. I think they're fantastic. And this is a great example of how you have this you have Minecraft, this thing around it, the SMP world, and spinning off of it all these animations. I just think that's amazing. That's a great example of the future.
Yeah, I totally agree. And the crazy thing is, this is it's like a play or something that's being documented from all these different people's perspectives, right? Because they're all streaming. They're all streaming and recording and editing their parts, and actually in a darker turn, kids are bullying each other in real life over their allegiance to
I'm sure
different personalities in this, because it's quite, and actually I think they actually had to stop because it got so heated and kind of toxic that you know, these dramas were playing out, and it kind of overheated. I don't know all the details, but this is what I learned from talking to my young kids, and so there's a crazy. I mean, I do think that this combination of online play, video documentation, and user-generated content creation, this weird celebrity role playing. I mean, it's all. Nobody owns this, right? It's all playing out and happening, you know, kind of similar to some of the emergent stories that we got out of Eve, right? With the documentation of the wars and all that stuff that went on. But yeah, it's super duper interesting. And that's probably the layer of this stuff that I'm most interested in, as opposed to the story of Red Dead Redemption, which, while incredibly well executed and terrific, you know, everybody's having the same experience.
Exactly. And I think you may be right there. There may well be a generational aspect to this. My grandfather he watched TV, but he never really got used to TV. And that's how I'm old. He was older. But in the same way, there's been this sort of truism amongst game developers and game publishers that people want a predictable experience. Well, maybe. I think the systemic nature of this actually hits something deeper in us. And then if you add on top of that, oh no, I can create my own experience, either systemic or narrative, you know, linear narrative experience based on this thing that I had. And by the way, the thing I saw was unique. Like, there's a lot of screenshots coming out of No Man's Sky, which are these beautiful shots. And that's something that person had that nobody else is going to have. Yeah. Those have their own value.
Yeah.
And all of this, by the way, I think is swirling around the nature of meaning, which is this deep philosophical question. Get a bunch of game designers together late at night. You know, we can talk about that. But it's a difficult thing, again, to sort of articulate and say, how do we nail it down? How do we construct it? That's really the hard part. So we're all kind of feeling our way, and every once in a while something like Dream SMP comes up, like, oh look, this works.
Yeah. And
you know, a bunch of other things like it might not have worked. That one did. Awesome. What's the next thing? And then how can we turn these into principles? We can say, great, now do these things that will reliably work well. And that's when we get big business in, once it reliably works.
One of the things you mentioned big business. One of the things that I think we're seeing, which kind of intersects with big business, but also kind of this Dream SMP social phenomenon, is things like Dota, right? Dota 2 by Valve, right? The history, it's like a folk game, right? That it came out of this. And honestly, like if you look at, I mean, Valve, right, has very interestingly positioned themselves right on top of a bunch of these, right? But if you look at Counter-Strike, if you look at Dota, right, these are folk games. These are mods, kind of organically arising games that later somebody decided to jump on top of and make a billion-dollar business out of. But I feel like this is what we're seeing now, is that it's almost like game design is kind of bubbling up off the internet more, and those are where the mega hits are coming from. Look at Fortnite as well. I mean, the blatant theft of Epic Games of PUBG's,
a long tradition in games of doing
right,
that sort of thing.
Right,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
Like, I mean, they had a lawsuit, they lost. It's like, okay. But it's this kind of, I don't know how you describe it, but it's this is where the kind of mega hits are coming from.
There's an untested truism, but I think it's still largely true. This sort of pyramid of content users and generators, where you have a lot of people at the bottom who just want to observe something, people in the middle who want to play something, and people in the middle who want to modify something. The very top, people who want to create something new.
Yeah.
And those people each has a sort of a disproportionate effect on sort of all the layers below them. So I think that what you're seeing with something like Dream SMP is you can observe it, a few people play it, and in between there's people who are making subsidiary content or secondary content to it. And that's a very, very powerful model. It's also one that's really hard to capture in a business plan. I think once we see it a few times, we'll go, okay, I got this now. Here's my new business. Please give me $1 billion to make this thing. And I'm sure that'll happen at some point. And then everyone will forget Fortnite. I actually had a student a year ago who said, I think Fortnite is like the way of the future. I said, really? I think it's more flavor of the month. Something else is going to come along. And he was kind of offended that because it was his world for that moment. But he also like, okay, what were you playing 5 years ago? Because it wasn't Fortnite. 5 years from now, what are you playing? He's like, oh, I guess you're right. So there's a lot of evolution that's happening very, very fast. That's something that has struck me many, many times. I mean, really, one of the reasons I got into games there's a lot of reasons, but one of them is that things evolve faster in games than anywhere else because we're always on the forefront of technology and graphics and interactivity and all these things. And part of the reason for that, to me, is really interesting, is that no one has to play a game. So if you're working someplace and they say, here's your new accounting system, you're going to go, okay, this is terrible.
Right? It can't lose
I
the data.
got to use it. Yeah.
Right.
But if I say, here's this new game I worked on really hard, you're like, I don't like it. Drop it. Done.
Right.
So it's got to be engaging from the second you see it. And like at Kabam, we did lots and lots of really expensive studies on which Facebook icon worked the best to draw people in, to get that first click. All the way through, are you still playing it 100 hours later or 6 months later?
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot of really interesting things there about games, particularly where we're seeing this really, really rapid evolution. So, where is this going to go next? I think, in the systemic area, like we're talking about, but then you say, okay, but what about subsidiary content, like spinning off people doing their own 2D videos or whatever?
Yeah.
There's just so much there. It's hard to kind of wrap your arms around it, which is why I think we're still seeing this happening on kind of an ad hoc basis, as opposed to someone saying, hang on, I have the perfect business plan. We're just not there yet.
No, I think that's right. And I think also that there's a kind of a momentum that has to build up and I don't know. I feel like it's saying that this is your business plan is like planning to catch fire, right? Or planning to succeed, right? Be like, the plan is going to be really good and everybody's going to love it and it's going to snowball, like that's a difficult thing to plan for, right? Yeah, exactly. Oh yeah, sign me up, right? Take the money, right? Yeah. So I think that's, I think that, but the point that you make about evolution and actually the kind of voluntary nature of game playing, it does make it this kind of fierce Darwinian environment in the sense that, like you say, nobody is going to say, well, our company has now switched over to Blue Book's accounting software. You have to use it, right? In this case, it's like, no, I get home at night. I'm going to play this until I get bored, and then I'm just going to go grab something else. And that there's that low switching cost and that kind of just purely like, I don't feel like it anymore. And that puts this intense pressure on, making things more and more and more engaging.
This is one of the reasons I kind of lament the end of the age of the video arcade,
Yeah.
Because they're sort of in evolutionary terms, the evolutionary currency was really clear. It's a quarter.
Yeah.
If I put a quarter in machine A instead of machine B, in evolutionary terms, machine A is much more likely to have offspring. It's more likely to have more games like it.
Yeah.
There was a brief period in like the mid 80s, I think, early 80s, where there was like a whole bunch of tank and Jeep games, and they were great because I loved them. And then there was one fighting game, and I didn't like it so much, but a bunch of my friends did. And then, 6 months later, a year later, there's a whole bunch of fighting games and one crappy little Jeep game left.
Yeah.
Yeah. But that's the way the evolution went,
Yeah.
We still see that, but now we see it on Steam where you may have wonderful games, or the Epic Store, give them credit, but
Yeah.
you may have wonderful games that just never get noticed.
Yeah.
Or an itch or any of these platforms. And then, a year later, some big studio comes along in sort of parallel evolution, makes them really similar, and you got some indie over here going, hang on a minute, my game did exactly that, and no one played it. How come? Well, you just didn't get the dollars to keep it going, so no one noticed it, so it died off.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's brutal, and kind of like real world evolution, brutal and yet kind of wonderful to watch from as long as you can stand well back.
Yeah, exactly. As long as you can not get eaten yourself, it's great, right?
Exactly. That's the main goal. Don't get eaten yourself. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. No, I think that's super interesting. And I guess that's a way to, to kind of turn the conversation a little bit. I mean, for us now as folks who are wanting to make games, wanting to do it in a commercial model, right? It's not a hobby. It's not a pure piece of performance art. How do we find a way, you mentioned saying, talking about business models, business plans, how do we find a way to kind of, I don't want to say create predictability but basically reduce risk in this and make things that are good, right? I mean, obviously that's a huge question. It's top of mind for me right now. So please tell me how to do it, right? But I mean, I think this is, especially on the indie scale, right? Obviously bigger companies have a buffer and they have capital to play with, right? But I think that, on the indie scale, you're talking about risking your capital. That may be the only capital you're going to get for a while, right? Till you go get another job and earn some more, right? So, I mean, I'm just wondering, like, what can we do there to try to mitigate some of that risk, specifically from a design perspective? Obviously, business, marketing, we've talked about, right?
Yeah. Well, so first of all, I just point out that in terms of risk, big companies deal with this exactly as much as indies do. Really, I think there's sort of a proportional ramp where if you're a solo indie, you've got all the stuff on your shoulders and you're trying to worry about it, and it can be crushing. I mean, I've been there, but I've also been a general manager in a AAA studio where there's like, okay, we're going to risk $10-20 million on this.
Right.
Is that the thing to do? Everyone goes home with a churning stomach because of what are decisions we're making. So you do have more of a buffer when you get some good funding, and that's really wonderful. I think the real answer is that there's no easy answer.
Yeah.
I think the saving points are in starting really small, starting really small, being as systemic as you can in your approach to the design, and trying to get the interaction loops going. So the loops within your systems in the game, and then between the player and the game, getting those working where it says, okay, this starts to feel like, hey, this might actually be kind of satisfying, even in a really bare bones sort of analog to gray box form.
Yeah.
Or maybe directly gray box. There's no art here yet. It's just, I've got the system working. You need to be careful though too, just because that can narrow your view of the kinds of designs that you can make. So in AAA, we often see really narrow designs where they will do one new thing. Say, take a well-known formula and tweak one thing, because that's all the risk they can handle. And so in an indie, it's really, we all want to say, I'm going to do this completely new thing. Well, you're adding risk to your pile, which means you're adding risk to the idea that you're not going to succeed. So you got to find the happy medium there. And one way to do this is to start small, make these systems say, okay, this now works, add a little bit to it, this now works. And that means working nights, weekends, whatever it means, or with some funding, if you can get, investor or grant funding or something like that, until you have something you go, okay, this now feels like a small shining bit of game design, gameplay that I've got, and then building up from there. There's a a strong desire, really almost imperative that we all, I think a lot of us feel, to move faster and to jump over some of the hard work, because we want to see the game be real. We want to see, well, the shiny art and the great menus and everything else, though no one likes making menus. Okay, there's 3 people out there who like making them. But we don't want to spend that time making the systems work. And that's really where the hard work comes in. And it can be lonely and it can be depressing, because you say, well, I've got this great idea and it doesn't work, and it doesn't work. I said once to another game designer, actually, I said this to Raph Koster. We were talking, a bunch of us talking. Raph's a friend, so I think I can say this. I said twice in my career, I've had a design for some systems that I made that when we implemented them, they just worked. And he said, either you're very lucky or you're a liar.
Or you're delusional, right? Like, oh, man.
It's like, no, I know these 2 times really well, because it's never worked other than that. And I think I've been lucky. Hope I'm not a liar. Anyway, but that's the kind of reality we need to prepare ourselves for. And to say, okay, I'm going to work on this for a while, and it's going to be terrible. It's going to look like crap. This is something that, Creativity Inc. I'm going to blank on his name. The Pixar head who wrote the book. Highly recommend the book, even though I'm blanking on his name for the moment.
Ed Catmull.
Catmull, thank you, Ed Catmull. He said that all of their games, actually took this quote out and put it in my book, all of their games at Pixar are terrible. He said they suck. And he said, people think I'm being like unduly modest. He said, no, they suck.
Yeah.
And I think that's true of any game, but especially any systemic game, where you don't have, well, we're going to have 20 levels and they're going to look like this, and so we can sort of rely on that. You have to get the systems working. But if you can do that, as hard as that is, then I think you've got a really good chance of making something kind of amazing and new and potentially, successful commercially.
Yeah.
That goes back to all the stuff we talked before about, a play span of, how long are you playing game? Are you playing this game versus have you played this game?
Yeah.
I think all those kinds of things are necessary. I think it's necessary for any indie game dev to have the business side of things in the back of their mind, even if they're trying to work on, I want to make this really meaningful, emotional exchange in my game.
Totally.
How do I do that? Well, I want to do this so that people play the games, will play for longer, so that eventually be successful and I don't have to go take another job.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's absolutely super to the point advice. And I think that that thing of wanting to skip over the hard part, right? And wanting to get to the art and get to all that. It's a powerful, I'm dealing with that right now, I totally get it. it's really tempting, and you want to feel a sense of visible progress, right? You want to feel, like that, getting that art in the game, or even just those concept art drawings, you just feel like, okay, I can see something,
There's a balance there too. Like, do I need to put this particle system in? I probably don't need to. But especially as you start doing playtesting, even early playtesting with other people, if you can show, it's all great boxes, but I've got this one cool particle system, that might be the visual feedback that they need to go, oh, I did that thing right.
Yeah.
So some of that stuff is necessary. Is it necessary that you completely serialize stuff so you're reading it all from a JSON file at start? Probably not. And yet, that can be really satisfying.
Hilariously, like literally the first thing I did on my... Oh, yeah. No, this is literally, I was like, I need to write a whole JSON serialization system. That's what I'm going to start with. Let's do that now. And then I'll start working on there's like, you can go find a video on my channel of me doing that hilariously. I mean, I think
none of us want to go back and refactor that either. We don't want to like,
you know what?
Later.
I threw it away. I actually threw it away, which is hilarious, but I replaced it with something from the Unity Asset Store. Just, it's
there you go.
There it is. And it's like it's ultimate inventory system. I was like trying to build a whole item database, and I was like, you know what? This guy already did it. I know Justin from Opsiv. I know he's a good programmer. I'm just going to use his thing,
I got to say that's one of the things that amazes me about the age we're in.
Yeah.
We have Unity, Unreal too, sure, but just to focus on Unity for a minute, with the asset store, I can now go out and get a ton of free assets or low-cost assets. We are chipping away pretty significantly at the things I have to do the art game design. which means we just have this hard nugget left of like, okay, I got to crack this thing.
Somebody give me a game design asset that I can just...
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's pretty amazing to me that it is coming down to that. Like, okay, great. Here are all these things out there. Make a game. Well, that's the hard part.
Yeah. But I do think, and maybe, it's funny because exactly as somebody who can program, I immediately jumped into what is kind of weirdly the fun programming part of writing all this data management, being clever, right? And kind of the game part is going to be really fun. It's going to be a design and it's going to be fun, and like, let me do some programming. Now I'm really making progress. I'm writing code and doing things, right? And what the kind of asset store and being able to use these pre-made ingredients tells you is, hey, what are you going to cook? What's for dinner? Like, it's like, you can get all this, you can get the pieces. Like, what are you adding to this, right? Not the crafts person, not the guy who can hammer in nails really well. Like,
right. Exactly right.
It's brutal.
Another way of, I've described this to my students. If they have an assignment to do, a lot of them, the first thing they do is say, well, I can't work because my room's too messy. So the first thing I do my homework is make my bed. And I should really fix that picture that's hanging crooked. And, really, it's like professors with grades, too. When grades are due, our houses are the cleanest they've ever been.
Yeah. Maybe I should walk the dog. Maybe I should walk the dog again. Like, yeah.
Right. So it's like that with we'll do anything to avoid the hard part, but that's where the hard part comes in. Yeah. And honestly, to sort of bring this back a little bit to some of the things we were talking about before, it's why I wrote the book. It's why I still continue to look for better ways to talk about designing systems, designing emergence, because if I can tell my students, for example, the first thing they don't have a game until they have one interactive loop.
Yeah.
If the player can do something, the game does something, the game gives feedback, the player is up to the next thing. Until then, it's not a game. And you can go for months thinking I'm making a game without that.
Yeah.
And actually getting to that loop early on can be really difficult, but it's a nice, good, I think, strong base to build on. The more we can understand how to build interactive systems and gameplay systems better, I think where the shorter time we're going to spend in that horrible, I don't know what I'm doing phase.
Yeah.
I don't think we'll eliminate it, but at least we can maybe limit it.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, I think that's really, and the crazy part, as someone who's in the moment of thinking about budgets and thinking about putting a bunch of money behind an idea, it's so important. How you make it is important, all that stuff, but what you make is probably the most important strategic commercial decision you're going to make, right? And if you build a beautiful table that nobody wants, it's beautiful and it sucks, and it's such a, it's good and bad, it's an opportunity, I guess.
Yeah, we talked about the marketing stuff where you could build this beautiful thing, and if no one knows about it, well, it sinks beneath the waves. But if you don't build a beautiful thing in the first place, if you build yet another puzzle platformer, that's going to be hard to get people to notice. Yeah. So I think that's and yet the first place we always go is to the thing we've just seen or the derivative ideas we've just played.
Yeah.
I had a couple of years where I told my students, you are not allowed to use the word Metrovania in this class because nope, seen too much of that. Yeah. Or now I say, okay, if someone says I want to build a Metroidvania game, okay, what does that mean to you? What is it you're really building? And then if they can talk about it knowledgeably, okay, there might be something there, but don't give me the shorthand because that hides too many things that you don't understand. And this isn't just for students. This is for all of us.
Yeah.
I say I'm building this sort of social game where the characters interact with each other. Okay, exactly how are they interacting? I'm like, well, that's the hard part.
That's the part that's going to be it's going to be really good. We're going to just do something really good. That's don't worry about that. Yeah. The point about making something derivative is a really interesting topic from a design perspective. I think that related to the comment you made about Risk and AAA studios being like, we're doing a shooter, but it's got a grappling hook, and it's like, whoa, and that very iterative we've got this safe bundle of stuff that we really know how to do, and now we're doing one experimental layer or tweak or mutation on that, right? I definitely had the experience, the first game that I tried to make and failed to make, spent multiple years working on, part-time, but failed to make. One of the reasons that it failed was there are many, many reasons that it failed, but one of the reasons was it wasn't close enough for me to copy significant ideas from existing other games, and I wasn't a good enough designer to just design this thing from whole cloth without kind of solid references around me to steal from, And this is something that I'm mindful in thinking about the new game that I'm trying to design is like, there are big chunks of this that will like serve an important role and be functions in the game that are just going to be like other games, And then this little piece here is the part where I'm going to try to do something original and hopefully exciting, but from a kind of a risk and not biting off more than I can handle in a design perspective. That's kind of part of the way that I'm trying to think about it. I don't know how that sits with you.
I think it's really smart. I should say, sort of as a disclaimer, that I have a bent towards always doing something new, and that's not particularly healthy.
Yeah.
My entire career, actually multiple careers, I've been too early to the party, trying things out too early, trying crazy things. I've somehow made it work, but there's been a lot of big craters I've left behind me. Yeah. So I think what you're doing is actually really, really smart. And you can look at things like, to go back to movies for a second, there's a lot of romantic comedies. And you go into a romantic comedy knowing what you're going to get. So there is some value to telling the players, this is a puzzle platformer. Now, that's probably the most saturated genre out there. But saying, this chunk, you understand, it's a role-playing game, so you understand pretty much what's going on. But then if you think about a movie like The Sixth Sense, which I'm going to try not to spoil for people, but that movie did some interesting things with, we all know how to watch movies. We all understand what a scene cut is. And what happens when there's a scene cut, people are out doing things till the next time we see them. Well, that movie kind of subverted that in some really interesting ways. So I think doing that kind of thing where you say, yes, it's a role-playing game, but this is different. One of my students a few years ago made a game that started off as a platformer, ended up being a little bit different, but it was a game about you are a woman whose child has died, and you are trying to integrate your memories of her as part of your grieving process. A game called Soul. It's an amazing little game, and he did a lot of research on grieving and things like that, what that really means. But he had, because this is such an offbeat theme, he had to go back to, you are navigating a two-dimensional space and doing things that in a game sense feel normal, feel typical, with some twists. So for example, he had, when you make a choice, there were two pieces of text, and you could go to one piece of text or the other. And that's how you decided what was it that this woman was thinking. Yeah. But it was all done via 2D navigation. So he said, it was too much to sort of put them in, put the player in a three-dimensional world or something like that. You wanted to really sort of go as familiar and low risk as possible in parts so that you can go high risk on the other parts.
Right.
And this is something that I talk about in the book, not this exactly, although now I should probably put this in if I can do a second edition, but the idea of the interactivity budget of, if I want to have a game that is emotional, then I don't want to put a lot of high action in.
Right.
And there's some great research from Quantic Foundry that supports this really nicely. But what that also indicates is that people do need touchstones in the design. They do need points of familiarity from which you can depart.
Right.
But if it's all new, it's going to be too avant-garde, or if it's all the same, people will say, well, I've played this already. Why should I play this again? So you need to find that budget balance, or design budget balance, in the middle. Yeah.
No, I think that is really resonates with me. And I think that balancing the amount of familiarity so that the player is not going to be overwhelmed by whether it's could be thematic or could be mechanical, or finding that kind of right blend of novelty and familiarity. It's funny, in my past life I was a musician and a DJ, and literally kind of dripping out your budget of familiarity is like kind of the core skill of DJing, right? It's like, one song for me, one song for you. Like, this is this new song you all have never heard, and I know it, and it's great, and I'm going to share it with you. And then here's one of the hits that you know and love, and everybody comes back to the dance floor and starts dancing again, and it's literally
That's
that
a great
simple.
analogy. Yeah.
It's just this kind of push and pull. And as long as you don't do 3 weird songs in a row, the party keeps going, right? And I think that it's funny because I think that some people it depends. Everybody has to situate themselves on a kind of a commercial art axis, right, of how accessible they want to be. And being avant-garde is also great, right? But I think that people might feel that is a little bit, I don't know, crass or obvious. But I think that in terms of serving a player, like you say, you're trying to do some emotional narrative and you're hitting them with like bullet hell 500 flashing elements, like it's just not going to land, right?
Yeah. And there's really good psychological evidence for that. You aren't going to find a game that is League of Legends plus Crusader Kings.
Right.
And yet I will have students who will try and pitch a game like this. Like, nope, not going to work. Just no. Because people aren't equipped psychologically to deal with that much.
Yeah.
And the same thing in terms of design. Like, I've got 12 design elements in my game. 11 of them are new. And there's an avatar, but it's not really an avatar. It's like, no. You've got to pick a few things. And that's hard. And now, like you said, you can decide how avant-garde do you want to be. But that's really pretty literally an equation of the more avant-garde you are, the less commercial you are.
Yeah.
If that's okay with where you are, fine. But understand you're not going to find a sudden breakout hit for the super avant-garde game.
Yeah.
Whereas but on the far end of it, if you're making yet another puzzle platformer, again, you're not gonna get a lot of success. So the success point is somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, that definitely rhymes with my experience, and I think that obviously it's a very personal decision, right? What is important to you? How important is novelty? How important is the kind of your self-image as a brilliant and original artiste? Funnily enough, when I was a lot younger, that was a lot more important to me. And now that
how important is paying the rent?
Yeah, exactly. Now that I've got a bunch of people depending on me for their livelihood, including my children, I have a more measured opinion, which is a funny thing about how life works. But I mean, I think that one self-serving question that we haven't totally landed on that I've been wrestling with and that you and I were discussing briefly on Twitter is, and a couple other people were weighing in with some good opinions and advice, is thinking about going back to that thing of kind of validating systemic games and, building up from small loops, which I think is really, and maybe is the answer here, right? But one of the things that I'm thinking about now is, obviously, in a linear content-based game, you have the idea of a vertical slice, right? Where you build like a single level. And I think it's a good way to say, yeah, this looks like it should look and it plays like it should look. And we can kind of say, or a publisher can say, yeah, I want more, give me 10 more levels of that. And we've got a deal, right? When we're trying to do these more systemic kind of things, what's the kind of minimal viable product, or how can we even evaluate something that it relies on a bunch of things interacting when, at a small scale?
Yeah, it's a really tough question.
Yeah.
So a couple things I'd say. First, I mentioned getting that first interactive loop. I think that's really important. But one of the problems you can hit there is if you aim just for that, then you get a really nice toy. I can do this thing and it's kind of cool, but it's not cool for more than 30 seconds. And it's like, okay, why would I keep playing with this? Because it just does one little thing. It's a little spinning top or whatever. So I think it's really important to have this view that I talk a lot about, of sort of this multi-level view where, as a designer, you are thinking about, here's the experience I'm going for. To do that, I have to build these systems that support that. To do that, I have to have these numbers in an Excel spreadsheet someplace, or a JSON file someplace, and to be able to move up and down that scale. And if there's a vertical slice, that's sort of where you got to slice through all those layers. Now, you're not going to have the same assurance that you get from sort of an old school vertical slice. You say, great, you made this, like you said, make 20 more levels like that, and we're good to go. So now it's just make a bunch of content, because they've got the basics of the system. And sure, you're going to add a little more combat or whatever, but the basics are there.
Yeah.
You don't have that luxury with a systems game. So making that first toy and saying, okay, I've got this thing, and then I'm going to sketch in both sketch and art, maybe literally, but I'm going to sketch in a set of outer loops to this that if you play it and a few trusted people play it, and maybe you say, here's the game I'm going for. This is about, I don't know, you're on board a 16th century ship and you are in love with the captain. Go. What happens? What are you trying to do? Or maybe you're trying to get the captain to be in love with you. I don't know. I'm making this up. Sure. But if you can say, okay, well, I've got to swab the deck. I got to do these things. I've got these micro things I got to do, that then I put in a really rough system of like, oh, the captain has noticed you. Oh, we did well in port. The captain now esteems you more. So just putting in the systemic equivalent of, I've got one level, and I've got the lower part of this is this one level I've made where it's really, that one's nailed down. I've got that one pretty well. And I got these sketchier and sketchier ones that at least give me the idea that, yes, I can get to this kind of experience I'm trying to build. I think it's there's probably a sloping curve there. I want to have a lot of stuff at the very low level and sketchier and sketchier and sketchier stuff to the high level. How much of that is always an open question, just as it is with a vertical slice.
Yeah.
If you have trusted game designer friends, they may be able to see it. If you have a couple of, if a few people who know your games or who are interested in this style of game, they can probably see it because they can put their mental model onto it. Oh, right. This is a seaborne romance. I love those. I get this, Yeah. I'm not sure what the deal is with the canon, but we can come back to that, Right. But it's a matter of balancing. Is there, first of all, a game there? And then can I, as the player, connect that and build even a threadbare mental model up to the sort of the experiential layer that you want to have at the top? And without that, it either feels like a toy that doesn't go anywhere, or, yeah, there's this kind of cool and interesting experience, but I don't see how that actually becomes enacted in the game. And so I think I don't think it's a single formula for it, but I think the detailed to increasingly threadbare systems, like I've just got this thing sort of blocked out, like, The captain says +1,
Yeah.
It's not later. That'll be a bunch of dialogue or something. Right now it's just +1.
Yeah.
And then people who, like I said, people who know you or know that kind of game will be able to read it effectively.
Right.
This is the other danger, of course, is that you may be able to read it effectively and no one else can. In which case, you got to put more in. But then how do you get around the trap of saying, well, and frankly, I would consider sort of a Dwarf Fortress trap. How do you get around the trap of saying, well, it doesn't work unless everything works? And I think that for indies, you've got to be able to get around that trap.
That's the part that I'm afraid of. But I think that makes a lot of sense. And that's kind of the way that I've been thinking about it from an implementation perspective, is try to get that minute-to-minute loop with some level of real interactivity, right, in terms of a playable prototype. And then it's kind of stubbier and stubbier as you get to the outer loops, right? And that, it's maybe it's just almost like non-interactive type screen or prompt that's just like, you crafted something, you successfully crafted with the resources that you got. Here's a number,
Sorry, one thing I've experimented with that I think has worked pretty well is taking images you can find online for like a mood board or something like that, and using those as, here's the result. Either this is a success or this is a failure or whatever. This is the outcome. And by using an image, it's like, this stands in for a whole bunch of other stuff I'm going to do later on, but gives you the feeling of, oh, that's cool. Like, just the image of someone opening a treasure chest or a scorched crater in the ground. It may not have anything to do with the game itself, but gives you the feeling of where that's going to go. You go, oh, right. Okay. I see now. I shouldn't have let that thing happen, back there, end up this way.
Right. Instead of like some debug log text being like, you died.
Right. Because it's more and more about feelings. Yeah. At the top. I think that's something that, especially if you spend all your time focusing down at the lower layers, you say, well, if I had a debug prompt, what's the problem?
Yeah.
Like, no. You want a picture of a rose. That's you want something that's more affective and less literal.
I think that's a really interesting point, and that connects back to something earlier about prototypes and feedback, and gray boxing. And there was I can't remember who gave this talk, but there was a good talk that I saw. And actually Dan Cook, who's amazing, talked about this a little bit, saying, you don't want to polish your gray box, right, and put a bunch of superfluous detail on there, but if those particle effects or sound effects or whatever are gonna deliver the feedback, then that's not polish. That's
right.
Part of the mechanic or whatever. That, for me, I feel like I've now understood that a little bit better, I had this kind of austere idea of gray boxing, right? To be like, no, it's we're not allowed to have any fun here, and it's got to be utilitarian. You know what I mean? Like, otherwise we're being unvirtuous by putting in particle effects that we should.
Well, I'm falling into that trap of I want to do the fun thing, but really the fun thing can be the necessary thing.
Yeah.
And you mentioned sound, and I think it's worth reinforcing that, because as designers, I think we often ignore the power of sound. As there's it's not really a quote by George Lucas, but that the sound is half the picture.
Yeah.
And I think by having, if you had a wah wah sound, that tells people a lot right there, and sometimes, going the other way, a nice particle effect or something as a victory condition can, I feel like, I'm thinking of something like Peggle, which just goes way over the top with
Classic.
that. But if you have something in there that you can put in relatively quickly that confirms to the user, here's this feedback, here is some nice perceptual feedback, visual, auditory, whatever, that is, or even maybe something a little more social. It's an image of a guy looking hurt, and you have a printed line of text that says, "I thought I knew you." Right. Oh my gosh, that gets you in the heart right there. Or yes, I will marry you. Whatever is appropriate for your game. I expect you to die. There's all kinds of things you can do with very, very little, just again to get that feeling across. And I think that's really the point where you need to have an unbroken line from the deep sub-basement of the game where all the numbers are up to the sort of ephemeral feeling you're trying to get. Not all the feelings and not all the possibilities, but at least enough to illustrate where this game goes. I think, and again, like, it's stubbier and stubbier as you go on. I think it's an important point you made too. You don't want to polish your gray box levels, but you do want to make sure that they have the right rhythm, or that you have the right amount of feedback, the right kinds of feedback. If I'm trying to get the picture of the rose and I keep getting the sad trombone, as a player, I mean, maybe that's appropriate for the game. If I'm making the Dark Souls of romance, I don't know where that goes, but but I may become frustrated too. So, but all of that is part of the player's experience and mental model. And what you're trying to do in that first prototype is to say, here is where this is going to go, just like with a vertical slice. And if you can demonstrate that, even in a very stubby form, I think you've got a much better chance of convincing someone else, but honestly also convincing yourself 6 months in that this is still a good idea.
Yeah.
Because you can look at it and say, no, I've got that experience there. I know it works. I just need to make more of it.
Right. No, I think it's very interesting thinking about, which goes back to the kind of idea of the system of the player and the game, right? But thinking about really that the goal of the prototype is to create that affect, right? To create that feeling in the player's head. And however we get there, whether it's an image or a sad trombone sound or could be a piece of text, that if that communicates and sets off the right, emotions, then it's working. And probably we want to do that in the cheapest shorthand, most impactful way possible, right?
Exactly right. And I think there's another interesting parallel too, that in the game there is a bunch of, I talk about the sub-basement of, like, I was thinking of Excel as a sub-basement where my numbers are, all the way up through the finely crafted dialogue. Well, in the player, there's a mental model of, I need to click on this button to make this happen, or use this part of my controller, or whatever I'm doing. That's the sub-basement for the player, all the way up to, I want to save this person from this fire because they've been good to me, whatever. I want to do this thing because I'm going to feel this way. Without that feeling, honestly, I have to ask, why are you making the game? There was I don't remember who it was now, but it was a game developer who said, one of the things they say early on in development was, we will not ship this game until the player feels X. And that, so that's a good target for your vertical slice. Can you get someone to at least feel it a little bit, or say, oh, I see how this would lead me to regret or love or whatever it is. Yeah. Or just, it's a bullet hell and I'm having a great time. Thanks very much.
Sure.
So it doesn't have to be a refined emotion, but any emotion at all, you've got to have something there. So I think using those kinds of shorthands that can sit atop the player's mental model, all where they go, oh, because I made these interactive choices and because I got this feedback, now I understand what this feedback means. And maybe that's a 5-minute experience. It doesn't have to be very long.
Right.
And that's where then building up the systems and unstubbing the systems comes into play. We say, well, now we're going to make this very small amount of systemic land into a much larger volume.
Yeah. I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think that as we start to wrap up, the one kind of, I don't know if it's a inversion or the kind of counter to this. You mentioned Peggle. Peggle, obviously kind of an amazing game. It's like a pure only feedback almost, right? It's like, right? It's you. Yeah, for people who don't know, you launch a ball and it goes through this kind of pachinko bouncing, and everything it does is and particles and fireworks and and it's fun.
I use it as an example of I use it as an example of operant conditioning or positive reinforcement in a game. It does things like when you're about to hit the last peg, the ball slows down and the camera zooms in. It has a drum roll and then fireworks and ode to joy and a rainbow. I mean, it really goes over the top. But that's all a very low level kind of interactivity.
Yeah,
it's very immediate, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that at all. But if you're trying to go for something a little more planning, cognitive oriented, or emotion or social, those are much longer loops that take more to build up. It's hard to get to an emotional loop payoff in a vertical slice, except that you can rely on, I think I've used this to good effect. You can rely on tropes that people already know. And even think about memes. Like I haven't done this yet, but I might just put in, the flaming Elmo meme or whatever, whatever is appropriate. If you use something like that my audience is going to get, whoever the playtesters are, I would not be afraid to use something like that at all. If they say, right, I am playing as, something trying to destroy the city for whatever, and I see that Elmo with the flames behind him come up, I know something about what I just did. I have a mental model for that already. So I think relying on tropes and things that people already know early on is really important. You don't be too slavishly attached to those, obviously.
Right. No, I think that's actually really, really interesting, right? And basically what we're doing there is just leveraging all of the kind of cultural background and baggage that we can to kind of deliver a payload with as little signal as possible, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Very, very interesting.
And later make that more nuanced, Yes, you destroyed the city, but there's regret mixed in too.
Right. You're a sophisticated villain. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Nuanced. Yeah. No, absolutely. Well, I think that's a great point to bring things to a close. So for folks who would like to learn more about you and follow your work, where should they head to?
Oh, I hang out online these days, mostly on Twitter as Online Alchemist. I've also got a blog that people still read blogs, Online Alchemy. It's on WordPress that I post to every now and again. But really, Twitter's the place to find me these days.
Awesome. Yeah, and I can attest to that. I think some of the stuff you've been writing on Twitter has been super informative and thought-provoking. So I encourage everybody to go and to check that out. And I'll put a link, if you're watching on YouTube, down in the description box. And, totally wholeheartedly recommend the book, Advanced Game Design. You can get that on Amazon, or the independent bookseller of your choice. It's hefty stuff. It's not light reading, right? So get ready, but I've learned a ton from reading it. So thank you for writing it and sharing it. And I encourage other folks to check that out. And this has been a great conversation. Super interesting. I really appreciate your making the time to share your thoughts, and hopefully we'll get to do it again.
Yeah, thanks very much. It's been a ton of fun, Matt. Really appreciate it.
Awesome. All right.